Monterey Bay, California, winter of 2016. And 50 sea otters are floating on their backs in water so cold it fogs at the surface, each one cracking a sea urchin against its own chest, with a rhythm so deliberate it looks like work because it is work. Beneath them, the seafloor is bare rock, a place researchers call an urchin barren, where purple sea urchins have grazed every living kelp, hold fast down to nothing, leaving the reef as empty and pale as a parking lot, stretching for hundreds of meters in every direction. Those 50 animals were consuming up to 25% of their own body weight every single day in urchins. A feeding rate so relentless that it functions less like grazing and more like a controlled demolition of the thing that was killing the forest. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years documenting ecosystems in collapse and in recovery on both sides of this continent, and I have learned to be very careful about the word recovery. Because what I read in those field reports from Monterey Bay was not recovery, it was physics. Marine ecologist Dr. Terry Nicholson, a kelp monitoring specialist working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, was in the water that morning with a transect tape and a clipboard, and she documented something her 2-year recovery timeline had not scheduled. The first visible kelp holdfast attachments were already forming on bare rock. Inside 3 weeks. Here is where it gets interesting. She had penciled in 24 months before any measurable canopy recovery was expected. The otters made that estimate wrong by 22 months, collapsing a 2-year projection into something that had already started before she finished writing the baseline. What she had projected versus what she found? A 24-month recovery window on one side of her notebook and visible biological recruitment on bare substrate at week 3 on the other. Now, think about what that means for a moment. Because somewhere else on this coastline, at that exact same time, California was spending $22 million on industrial urchin removal programs, hired divers, barge-mounted machinery, budget cycles, and quarterly reviews, trying to do manually what 50 animals were doing for free every morning before the fog burned off. You are going to want to know how $22 million of coordinated human effort compared to what those otters produced, the canopy measurements, the species counts, the carbon numbers. And that comparison is coming, and it is not a comfortable one for anyone who approved those budgets. 50 animals, a daily biological function, and a dying forest that had been waiting, not for a program, not for a budget cycle, but for something that never stopped being hungry. The surface of the water tells you nothing. You see blue, you see light fracturing through the chop, sea lions on the rocks, a coastline that looks the way a healthy coastline is supposed to look. The brokers agreed with what your eyes told you. But Dr. Terry Nicholson at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute was not measuring the surface. She was measuring the bottom, transect by transect, season by season. And what her data described was a coastline in the process of going silent in a way that would not announce itself until it was too late to reverse. The map of that silence is worth sitting with, one location at a time. Along the Sonoma and Mendocino coast, canopy cover had dropped by more than 90% between 2014 and 2019. 10,700 square kilometers of productive seafloor reduced to spine and sediment, grazed to the substrate. In Monterey Bay, urchin densities had reached 70 individuals per square meter in zones that used to produce juvenile fish by the thousands. The rock was not visible beneath them. Off San Luis Obispo County, dive surveys recorded near zero juvenile fish recruitment across 3 consecutive seasons, the nursery function gone entirely. In the Northern Channel Islands, canopy extent had contracted to less than 15% of its 1980s coverage, and the rockfish populations that tracked that canopy had followed it down. 70 urchins per square meter. That number needs a physical anchor to mean anything. Imagine a floor you cannot see, not a floor covered in a thin layer of organisms, but a floor where every centimeter of rock is occupied by a spiked, grinding, consuming machine that has already eaten everything reachable and is now simply waiting. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Each of those 4 locations had crossed what ecologists call a threshold state. Not a point of stress, not a warning signal, but a hard biological boundary past which the system cannot self-organize toward productivity without an external forcing agent. The urchins, in the absence of predation, had shifted from grazers to occupiers. The Northern Channel Islands data is particularly instructive here. By the time the state's monitoring programs flagged the collapse as a fundable crisis, canopy coverage had already been contracting for the better part of 4 decades. A slow failure that accelerated catastrophically after 2014, when a marine heat wave pushed water temperatures high enough to weaken spore viability across the entire California coast. You are probably forming a question right now about how a state with monitoring data this precise managed to spend $22 million on restoration programs that still produce less canopy than 50 free-ranging predators. And that answer is coming with the budget breakdowns and the canopy measurements side by side, and you will want to stay with it. What the MBARI 2016 exhibit, Dr. Nicholson's cataloged field log, made visible was the gap between projected and actual timelines. Her monitoring protocol had built in a 24-month window before expecting measurable biological response. The hold-fast attachment she documented appeared at week 3. The seafloor was not dead. It was waiting for pressure to be removed. And that distinction between a system that has collapsed and a system that is suppressed is precisely where the $22 million program and the 50 predators parted ways in their assumptions. One treated the seafloor as a construction site. The other treated it as a compressed spring. The canopy measurements from both approaches are on record, and they do not tell the same story. The divers went in with hammers, not metaphorical hammers, actual steel hammers, swung by hand in cold Pacific water near Fort Bragg, crushing urchins one by one against bare rock while the bags filled and the clock ran and the invoices climbed. Between 2014 and 2022, that effort, manual culling, mechanical removal, coordinated dive operations along the Northern California coast, accumulated into a single audited figure, $22 million spent trying to do by hand what a predator does by appetite. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. That $22 million purchased 8 years of continuous intervention, and the urchins were still there at the end of it, waiting because the ecological pressure that produced them had never been touched. Dr. Terry Nicholson at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute tracked what happened after one major culling event near Fort Bragg. Within 8 months, urchin density in the target area had dropped to measurable lows, a genuine documented reduction that looked, on paper, like progress. Then the 14-month mark arrived. Urchin density had rebounded to within 85% of its pre-removal levels, not because the culling had failed technically, but because nothing had been placed in the ecological role that keeps urchin populations from exploding in the first place. You are not restoring an ecosystem when you remove the symptom and leave the cause. You are maintaining a treadmill, and someone has to keep paying for the electricity. That distinction is not philosophical. It is measurable, repeatable, and documented in MBARI 2016 field records that carry Dr. Nicholson's name on the cover. Now, you are probably wondering whether anyone making the funding decisions knew this, whether the institutional resistance to otter reintroduction had a rational basis, or whether it was something older and more stubborn than rationality. That answer is coming, and it changes how you read everything that followed. As late as 2019, commercial fishing industry groups were formally arguing that otter reintroduction would devastate shellfish and crab harvests along the Northern California coast, an objection with real economic weight and real legal infrastructure behind it. What actually happened in the zones where otters re-established naturally through range expansion was documented within 2 seasons. Kelp recruitment accelerated, juvenile fish populations returned to previously abandoned habitat, and biodiversity indices climbed beyond what the existing recovery models had projected as achievable. They said the otters would cost the fishery. The otters rebuilt the fishery. And the $22 million program, whatever it purchased, did not purchase that. The difference between those two approaches, 50 predators eating constantly versus 8 years of funded human intervention, is not a story about money. It is a story about what a biological role actually costs when you try to replicate it without the biology. That accounting is next. That accounting begins with a single animal dropping 10 to 20 meters straight down through cold Pacific water, selecting its target from bare rock and returning to the surface in under 4 minutes, carrying the entire mechanism of forest recovery in its teeth. Each animal consumes roughly 2.5 kilograms of spiny grazers per day, up to 25% of its own body weight. And it does this every single day, driven not by a program directive but by hunger, which is a more reliable enforcement mechanism than any grant cycle ever devised. Across a group of 50 animals working a single stretch of coastline, that daily hunger translates to approximately 45,000 kilograms of grazing pressure removed from the reef system every year. No salary attached, no seasonal layoff, no contract expiration. The spores have always been there, suspended in the water column, waiting. Clear the substrate and they attach almost immediately. Juvenile kelp fronds extending upward inside 3 to 6 months, reaching 5 to 8 meters of canopy height by the end of the first full growing season. Dr. Terry Nicholson at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute had logged the first confirmed return of juvenile rockfish to a formerly barren monitoring site in 2016, arriving 11 months after confirmed predator residency, a full 13 months ahead of her most optimistic projection. Her field log, cataloged as the MBARI 2016 exhibit, recorded biological recruitment visible at week 3, collapsing a 24-month recovery timeline by 22 months. Not a rounding error, a complete rewrite of what the model said was physically possible. Stay with this. You may be forming a reasonable suspicion right now that the grazers simply relocated to adjacent reef sections and stripped those bare instead. The spatial survey data that answered that question is coming, and what it showed broke the population model entirely. By the second year, mature giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera, approached 15 to 20 meters in height, constructing a vertical habitat column that restructured light penetration at depth, altered thermal buffering across the seafloor, and created refuge for species nobody had written into the recovery targets. The forest rebuilt its own physical architecture, canopy absorbing surface light, mid-column fronds sheltering juvenile fish, hold-fast roots anchoring the structure to bare rock below. A 3-layer habitat engineered by appetite, not intervention. A forest like this sequesters carbon at 12 times the rate of a terrestrial forest covering equivalent ground. And it maintains that rate as long as the predator stays. The predator always intended to stay. What happens to that carbon accounting when the predator is absent is the number that should make you uncomfortable. That carbon number, the one that should make you uncomfortable, did not stay abstract for long, because while the data was being celebrated in conference rooms, the otters were moving, not metaphorically, physically, into water nobody had cleared for them. The monitoring projections were built on a reasonable assumption that a recovering otter population would concentrate in designated low-conflict zones, well away from active shellfish leases and commercial crab grounds. The otters had not read those projections, and they were not interested in the boundaries drawn on someone's laminated map. By the time Dr. Terry Nicholson's team at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute completed their third-year spatial analysis, the animals had pushed into at least 4 zones flagged as economically sensitive, each one carrying active leases, active investments, and active expectations. One of those zones included active abalone restoration sites, places where conservation-bred abalone had been reintroduced at significant cost, caged and monitored, given every advantage a controlled program could offer. The otters found them anyway. That is what otters do. Near Año Nuevo State Park, in one documented case that Dr. Nicholson's team logged in the MBARI 2016 exhibit, otters consumed juvenile abalone from a restoration cage array within weeks of the abalone being placed. An event that put 2 recovery programs in direct, legitimate conflict inside the same stretch of water. The tension that created was genuine, not manufactured drama, genuine operational friction between people who had spent years and real money trying to bring back a species, watching another recovered species dismantle their work inside of a few weeks. That frustration deserves to be named, not explained away. You need to hold this number alongside that frustration. The California sea otter population fell to approximately 50 individuals in the 1930s. Every abalone farmer watching an otter work through a cage is looking at an animal whose entire species came within a single catastrophic season of vanishing from the Pacific coast permanently. That population has climbed to fewer than 3,000 individuals today, a number that sounds like success until you realize it represents a species still classified as threatened, still dependent on a coastal ecosystem that is itself still finding its way back. And this is where the data asks something harder of you. The otter is not malfunctioning. It is not exceeding its role. It is doing precisely what a keystone species does, asserting its own ecological logic without asking permission from the grant cycle or the lease map. The friction is not a sign the system is broken. It is a sign the system is working. You may be wondering whether there is a version of this story where both programs survive, where the otters keep the kelp thriving and the abalone cages hold. That answer exists, and it is more specific than you might expect. Stay with this, because what the spatial data suggested next is the part that changes how you read every future restoration budget. Can both recoveries coexist? 3 decades of absence, 3,000 surviving animals, 4 breached economic zones, all 3 truths occupying the same 20 meters of water at the same time, with nobody's permission, and the kelp growing through all of it. What you just watched is not a conservation success story in the way that phrase usually gets used. It is a physics demonstration, and the difference between those two things matters more than most grant reports will ever admit. Remove the pressure, and the system returns to the state it was always trying to maintain. Not because the ocean is generous, not because the timing was fortunate, but because biology follows the same rules as physics, and equilibrium is not a metaphor. Dr. Terry Nicholson at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute did not discover this principle. She measured it with a transect tape and a field log now cataloged as the MBARI 2016 exhibit. On a morning when she watched a holdfast form on bare rock inside 3 weeks, when she had projected 24 months. That is 22 months of projected waiting that simply did not happen, because the biological pressure, the urchin grazing that had held bare rock bare for 3 consecutive decades, had already been lifted by the time her measuring tape hit the substrate. What the $22 million program was attempting to engineer from the outside, a self-sustaining predator guild was already executing from within. And the gap between those two approaches is not a funding question. It is a design question that every future coastal manager will eventually have to answer. The math is not subtle. A managed industrial urchin removal program runs for months and then ends when the contract does. A resident predator guild, if the pressure is removed and the animals are left to re-establish, runs for decades. And the kelp it protects sequesters carbon at 12 times the rate of a terrestrial forest per hectare. That is where the data stops being comfortable, because it means the most expensive interventions are often compensating for the absence of something we already removed, and the correction was never going to come from a budget line. Drop your region in the comments, and name one species you have personally watched disappear from your coastline, your river, your hillside, in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence, from a 3-week holdfast to a recovering canopy that now shelters hundreds of documented cohabitants, says otherwise. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field. Next, we are going to the Isle of Rum off the Scottish coast, where reintroduced white-tailed eagles changed coastal grazing behavior in red deer herds, enough to measurably reduce cliff-edge vegetation erosion within just 6 years of their return. Scottish natural heritage delayed the mainland reintroduction for nearly a decade after 2007, citing livestock predation concerns. And the subsequent mortality data suggests that single delay cost the recovering population a full generational cohort. The open question that video answers: when a predator reshapes the behavior of its prey more than it changes their numbers, which effect do you manage for? And does the answer change when the prey is actively reshaping the land itself? Behavior or numbers? Which effect do you manage for?